trust. There has to be mutual trust for PBR to be effective. There has to be transparency. And there has to be, perhaps most importantly, mutual understanding. Mutual understanding of the principles and more specifically, the outcomes that we're trying to achieve together. And those outcomes have been identified and talked about in various contexts this morning. Things like contributing to confidence in the sectors we regulate, which is absolutely critical. It's critical to the regulator, critical to the businesses and pensions that are operated. Promoting high standards of conduct. Again, it works for both sides. Fostering strong, sustainable, and innovative sectors. And perhaps finally, and most importantly, protecting the rights and interests of consumers and protecting and safeguarding pension benefits and the rights of pension beneficiaries. So how you operationalize this is pretty difficult. We've gone through internally within FSRA the last 4 years. We've been on a journey, and you can't just wake up and say, okay, we're principles-based and everybody should understand that. And so we've spent a lot of time internally developing shared understanding, making sure our approaches are focused on principles to achieve specific outcomes. And we've tried to articulate that through our guidance, our rules, and even through our enforcement strategy. So where we are today is a really important dialogue, what I would say the next step, which is how do we engage more effectively with our sectors, and more particularly with the governance and oversight mechanism of our sectors, the board of directors. We're very fortunate, I'm very fortunate to have enlisted what I said is just an all-star panel, starting with Dr. Christy Ford, who's joining us virtually from Vancouver, and will hopefully be online in a few seconds. Dr. Allard really needs, Dr. Ford needs no introduction. She is a renowned expert in principles-based regulation and was instrumental in the province of BC developing an approach to their capital market securities regulation. To my far left is Peter Stevenson. He is a psychologist by profession and a partner at Hugeson Consulting and a renowned and recognized expert in corporate governance and board effectiveness. To Peter's right is, and I have a bit of I got two for the price of one with this panel member, Gail Rubenstein, who is chair of the University Pension Plan, which is a jointly sponsored pension plan, a JSPP, as pension people refer to it, and also is counsel at Goodman, the law firm of Goodmans. Gail has been involved in some of the most complex restructurings in Canada, including Stelco, and has a very intimate understanding of frameworks and how they sometimes, rigid frameworks, get in the way of trying to achieve the right outcomes. And finally, to my immediate left is Tom Vanderloo, who is the chair of Duca Credit Union. He is a CPA by profession. He also is on the board of, Central One, and he is the president of Redimo Management Consulting. And so welcome panelists. I believe we do have Dr. Ford. And so I'm going to start, and perhaps you'll get continuing legal education for the first question. Turning to you, Dr. Ford, is the subject matter expert on PBR, really to help us set the table for the panel and for this audience on PBR and how the framework, a PBR framework that a regulator embraces and adopts, how that changes the roles and responsibilities, not just of the regulator and the regulated entity, but more specifically, the board of directors of the regulated entity and its management. So if I could turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Jordan. Hello, everyone. It's a privilege to be here, and I appreciate being part of this fantastic panel. So I'm going to try and be very brief, just to cover some of the largest points about PBR, principles-based regulation. And I think I really have three main points. One is about what PBR sort of is in the big picture. Secondly, what it means for boards. And thirdly, what it means for the relationship between the regulator and its regulated industry. So in terms of what PBR is at a large sort of 30,000 foot level, it doesn't mean deregulation, and it doesn't mean reinventing the wheel completely. Its principles derive from the underlying regulatory regime that was there before. It also doesn't mean rules are gone. So any principles-based system is going to have a combination of rules and principles, which are just cast at a higher level of generality. What it does mean is that it means thinking about when a rule is appropriate and when a principle is the more appropriate way of framing a regulatory requirement. It means probably more requirements are cast at a principles-based level, at a higher level of generality, for a couple of different reasons. One is that one size really just doesn't fit all. Different industry players are differently situated, have different business models and different risks that they're running. And a principle is better suited to capturing that variety. It also manages to future-proof the regulation to a certain extent, because by thinking about the underlying purposes of regulation and how to achieve those results across time and across different players, it avoids the sort of detailed rule-based framing, which often just falls out of sync with reality. Now, regulators have a bottom line job of protecting the public. And so in a principles-based system, they have the responsibility for defining regulatory objectives and ensuring that industry achieve those objectives. But the difference with principles-based regulation is the recognition that there can be more than one way to achieve that outcome. So by focusing on outcomes and on ends, and while being willing to be flexible about the different paths for getting there, it has a better chance of congruence, of making the relationship between outcomes and means better and more effective. It also requires a certain level of buy-in to the compliance project, because the regulated industry is responsible for thinking about what applying those principles means for that firm in its own context with the view to the risks that it's running. So in terms of what this means for boards, I think boards have a significant role in setting the tone and permitting the mindset shift that's required. So complying with PBR means thinking about principles, thinking about your firm's business model. It involves a more active role for management, not just passively receiving instructions from the regulator. And the board has a responsibility to help management make that shift. So this probably has implications for the board in terms of composition, in terms of onboarding, in terms of culture. And there's a narrative or sort of vision-oriented piece, which really rests with the board. PBR is easier to comply with if you understand deeply who you are as an organization, and that's what's really called for here. The board may need to ask for different things from management as a result as well. So along with sort of helping to encourage and enable this mindset shift, maybe there's a need for more data, for efforts to be more forward-looking in asking management, for example, what are the core business risks that are being run? And so leadership from the board can identify the objectives that the regulator has set out, and then ask management how they are meeting those objectives with their own business and their own risks in mind. The third point I guess I would add is just in terms of the relationship with the regulator. So the relationship is not a gotcha one. The goal here is not to create a cat and mouse game between regulator and industry. The regulator has an important job in ensuring that enforcement is taken seriously to make sure that principles don't slide downward in compliance. And that takes a certain amount of courage, but at the same time, the regulator needs to be willing to be flexible about the means by which industry actors achieve the outcomes that the regulator has established. And with that in mind, communication is key. It's essential to have a two-way, forthright relationship. And so for industry, for boards as well, if there's a need for guidance on an issue, it's important to talk to the regulator early, not to hide problems. If something adverse has happened and you need to address it, it's crucial to engage and to come early to the regulator and talk with them to maintain that relationship of open dialogue and trust. So I hope that's covered off some of the larger points.
It is always, Dr. Ford, very insightful, and you've done it in a very succinct, digestible way. Peter, can I turn to you? You're an expert in governance board effectiveness. You've worked with, probably hundreds, if not thousands, of boards. What's different about board effectiveness in a PBR regime?
Well, thanks, Jordan. I'd like to drill down into some of Christy's comments, because I think within the PBR ecosystem, the board plays a real linchpin role that's different from some other environments where we may expect that, in fact, management has the core role and relationship with the regulator. In a principles-based regulation ecosystem, the board has a central role to play. And I think all of us need to think of ourselves, whether we're on the management side or on the board side of this, how do we ensure that the board understands that part of its role, part of its purpose for existing is to ensure that this partnership exists between the regulator and the organization. So not just delegating that to management, but to ensure that it exists. And so when we think about a board's mandate, when we think about how the board talks about what the board's responsibility, what the board's role is relative to management's role, when we think about how we onboard directors into this ecosystem, all of those are opportunities to reinforce what the role of the board is in the ecosystem. I think the second thing is that boards need to make sure that they've got people serving as directors who get it, and in fact have both the combination of industry knowledge and perspective to effectively challenge management in terms of, are we in fact engaging appropriately with the regulator in terms of how we're going about our business and our business model, but also in terms of challenging the outcomes that management's actually achieving, and are we getting the things that are intended through regulation. I think the third point, Jordan, that I'd emphasize, and Christy touched on this, is that the board, from a leadership and culture perspective, needs to ensure that the agendas we set, the materials that we put in front of the board, the way we engage with management, reinforce this notion that we have to focus on the public good, on these outcomes that the regulator wants, and ensure that our board agendas and our work as boards reflects that. And clearly we rely on management, especially key members of management who support the board and its committees' work, to help us stay on track with that. And I think finally, boards set the scorecards and set the incentive plans with management. And we need to ensure that management is focused in a forward-looking way on the outcomes that are intended in this environment. So I'd say those are four things that, regardless of the size and complexity of your entity, those are things that your board, with the management team's support, do well to focus on to ensure successful outcomes.
Thanks, Peter. That's very helpful. I agree that you can have the best principles in the world, but if you don't have the right incentives for people to follow them to achieve the outcomes, it's all for naught. Tom, let me ask you, on a practical level, you're chair of a regulated institution, a credit union. Does PBR change how you go about satisfying your fiduciary duty as a board member?
Oh, absolutely, Jordan. It's been said a few times, and I'll reemphasize that I think it makes the job of the board both more difficult, but more impactful as well, because in the past, the regulatory regime was a lot like, a checklist, right? You got a green check mark or a red check mark, and you built an action plan to deal with the red check marks, and then next year it happened all over again. But the principles-based regime means that we get to set our own sort of regulatory frameworks to some extent. It's not completely open field, of course. There are limits and thresholds that we have to deal with, and those are right to be there. But we have to work with management to understand the outcomes and the principles, but then adapt those to our business strategies and our realities of our business, and figure out what the best way for us to achieve those are. Now, in the credit union sector, we have the advantage of not having consumers. We have members,
right.
And members are always top of mind and first and foremost when we're making decisions about our strategy, we're making decisions about products and services that we offer and distribution and so on and so forth. But I don't think that doesn't solve the problem. The board still needs to be, a lot more engaged in discussing and deciding with management how we're going to achieve the outcomes, how we're going to comply with the principles, and still, manage within the rules and thresholds that, although they're less than they used to be, are still there and required.
Yeah, I would say, when I asked, because I was new to the credit union sector when I joined FISRA, it is the original ESG model when I think about it, right? There should be alignment because your members are your customers and you should always be acting in the best interest of your members.
Yeah, and our boards are, at least on our board, we're always focused on that and making sure that when we're making important decisions that the member impact is top of mind, understood, and that's what we're solving for in most cases.
So Gail, if I can get the benefit of my 2-for-1 deal, inaugural chair of the Board of Trustees for the UPP, and very accomplished, respected insolvency and restructuring lawyer. What do you do when the framework itself creates restraints or limitations from achieving those desired outcomes?
Well, thank you, Jordan. And in this case, given the compensation for this panel, I don't mind being 2-for-1. But starting off with my insolvency lawyer hat, I've dealt with a lot of matters on behalf of the province and the regulator, many of which had as a very important and, in fact, driving factor pension plans and issues with respect to the funding of the pension plan. And I just want to offer a slightly different perspective on this whole principles-based versus rule-based kind of regulatory regime, because I think there are some very understood principles that underpin the rules, so that when we look at the application of the rules, the interpretation of the rules, and how they should be implemented, it's really important to say, what's the principle on which this rule has been formulated? And how can we ensure that when we're applying it, we're doing it in the way it was meant to be applied? But yes, then there are the circumstances in which the words are clear in the statute, in the regulation, in the rules. And the question is, if you can't adapt them to the situation, what about changing them? And in fact, in numerous insolvencies, and you mentioned Stelco,
right,
the government and the regulator worked very closely with the stakeholders to come up with a path forward that would in fact allow for the sustainability of the pension plan and lead to the actual success of the entity. So the Pension Benefits Act was changed, there were new regulations brought in, and we're very happy to say we can celebrate a great success in the case of Stelco, both with the survival of the entity and with the sustainability of the pension plan, which has become 5 pension plans, which have become fully funded. Now, putting on a different hat, and the one thing you're always told when you walk into a boardroom is you only have one hat at that time, and that's the hat as a director. And the university pension plan, which is relatively new, it's in fact newer than FISRA, is a jointly sponsored pension plan. And I'll just explain that for a minute, because it's not a multi-employer plan, it's a defined benefit plan, but it does have a number of employers. And the governance is the key point, because it is governed jointly by the employers and by the beneficiaries, the members. So it gives the members a voice in their governance, in their future, in some of the investment decisions and policies, and most importantly, in also the choice of the trustees for the board of trustees. So it's essentially a joint governance process, but once you enter the boardroom, you're there as a fiduciary for the plan itself, and you leave behind any hat that you wore before you came into that room. In the case of the UPP, I've said it's a young, new entity, But it was many, many years in the making. Before I ever heard there was this kind of initiative going on. Our founders, the founding universities, U of T, Queen's, and Guelph, and their faculty associations, their labor unions, and their employee groups all came together with the goal of creating what would be ultimately a sector-wide JSPP available to the entire university sector. And in doing that, they had to work very closely with the regulator and with the province. The province had a clear ultimate policy of creating sustainable pension plans generally, but particularly with respect to the broader public service. And the process of creating sustainable plans included some consolidation and building of scale, because multiple plans, multiple costs, issues about the investments and the administration. So they came to the province. The province was very supportive. It's exactly in line with its policies. But the actual legislation, the Pension Benefits Act, actually spoke to existing JSPPs, jointly sponsored plans, and how new plans would come in. And I'll just give you as an example, HOOP, which is the hospital jointly sponsored plan, one of the huge ones that Mark was referring to earlier. Hospitals have joined at different times. They continue to join. And the Pension Benefits Act protects members and beneficiaries by setting out some rules for how each of those plans would join and what the members would be told and what would inform them as they made the decision to consent, because it is a consent process, to enter the plan. What the Pension Benefit Act didn't refer to was the creation of a new plan and the rules about notice and consent and all of that for the creation of a new plan. The ultimate result was a principle-based amendment to the Pension Benefits Act, which gives Mark, as CEO of FSRA, the discretion to create rules and to give relief from some of those provisions of the Pension Benefit Act. And this is, there are guardrails, so the discretion and the authority are exercised within the understanding of what the Act itself provides for other JSPPs. But it allows for pragmatism, dealing with reality, being creative, and it's a principles-based approach within a rules-based ecosystem. So we were formed, we were constated as a pension plan administrator on January 1, 2020. What we do as an administrator is pay the benefits, work with the beneficiaries, and invest the assets. The sponsors on the governance side created the plan. They have the responsibility for the plan text. They have the responsibility for appointing us, bringing in new entrants into the plan, and we have to work together. So we have, as administrator of the pension plan, as a board, fiduciary duties, as all boards do, but the UPP itself is a fiduciary under the Pension Benefits Act. So there's a sort of, we have a fiduciary duty to all of our beneficiaries. And the first thing we did as a board was work on understanding what were the contents of the fiduciary duty. How can we understand it and apply it to all kinds of different circumstances? And so that's a fundamental principle about owing a duty to your beneficiaries. Very early on, we appointed our CEO, and I'm giving a plug to us. We're very new, but we're very proud of how we've matured and of the management that we have. Our CEO is Barbara Svan, who is a pioneer in the field of ESG and has been a pioneer also and an advocate of defined benefit plans for many decades. And in fact, She was the CEO of the Year for the Globe and Mail. So we believe very much in our close alignment, in establishing close alignment with management about principles and about how we as a board and we as an administrator are going to carry out those fiduciary duties. One of the first things we did was to establish our foundational investment beliefs and make sure that we were aligned as a board and with management on what those investment beliefs are. Those investment beliefs underpin the statement of the SIP and P, the Statement of Investment Policies and Procedures, which is required by the regulator. So principles that lead into something that's required by the regulator. We've posted them on our website so our beneficiaries can see them. And they established also the responsible investing beliefs that we have also published so our beneficiaries can see them and so that we're transparent with our membership. We rely on management for compliance matters. So in the pension area, there's a lot of rules still. There's a lot of compliance that's required. There's a lot of green and red and all of that we have to think about every quarter, year, whatever. A lot of actuarial work that has to be done. And we rely on management for compliance and to report to us. And there are areas that are very strictly within the board's purview. We work together with management to be comfortable that we're getting the information we need to make the decisions we need to make and to ensure that the alignment continues. So it's yes, principles-based, but it's also something where we have to work together. Our relationship with FSRA, an ongoing open dialogue, is really important to us as a board and to management, and we think we are working hand in hand with management to fulfill that.
Thank you, Gail. Dr. Ford, if I can turn back to you for a second. I think I lost my mic. Oh, no, it's back. We've heard reference to terms like courage, transparency, communication, alignment. And I guess my question to you is, and recognizing I want to get to questions from the audience, is that enough for PBR to be successful?
Well, honestly, if I can just highlight some of the things that Gail said, I think it was a fantastic example of actually the various things that are required in a principles-based system. So as Gail pointed out, principles already exist in the rules, but it requires a sort of a focus on those principles and the courage to think about places where there need to be different ways of doing things in order to allow alignment, for example, with a jointly sponsored pension plan, which requires a different kind of structure. So courage is important in thinking about what those objectives are. Working well with management is important. Understanding the board's relationship to the compliance-oriented things that still have to be done, always with those principles in mind. And for the board, I think this does require moving past the compliance mindset that may still govern some of the rules to understand how management's relationship to those compliance mechanisms still have to be informed by the underlying principles. And so there's alignment with principles, alignment between management and the board, courage, and just the willingness to move past the green and red check box understanding of regulation that we've heard from a few different people now.
Thank you. Peter, quickly to you. So board capacity and skill set seems critical. You've got 2 board chairs here. What advice, free advice, would you give them in terms of how they're supposed to work to achieve
Gail
better?
knows there's no such thing as free advice when you're talking with a consultant. But I think it's this issue to underscore what Christy was just saying of this partnership with the regulator and figuring out in our unique circumstance, what does that mean? It's going to be different for DUCA than it is for UPP, but both need that effective partnership and relationship. And I think the board with the management team need to align around which piece of this, managing this relationship, is management accountable for, and what does the chair and the board perhaps need? What's that relationship look like with the regulator? Secondly, just ensuring a very clear line of sight to regulatory outcomes. How do we ensure as a board that we're helping management stay focused on those things and we're getting forward-looking, sort of predictive sense of how we're doing against those outcomes so that we're not surprised?
So before we open it up, Tom, to put you on the spot a little bit, is the regulator a stakeholder from your perspective?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, there we go. Yes, absolutely. You can hear me? Yeah, okay, thanks. The answer is for sure yes. And from a number of perspectives, first of all, I mean, we all in the credit union sector want to foster confidence in the sector so that, our members believe that their investments, that their deposits, that their mortgages are, we're worthy of them, essentially, right? And we need, the backstop of a regulator to be able to do that effectively. And then secondly, I think it's been said a number of times today, right? We're all moving into this PBR regime together, kind of figuring it out and feeling our way through it. And so, we can try and do that on our own. The regulator could try and do it on our own, but I think we're going to be a lot more successful if we work together on making sure that we're correctly interpreting the principles, we're correctly interpreting the guidance that comes out, that we're complying with the hard and fast rules that and thresholds that exist there, and that as the regulator, you understand the nuances of our business and how we're adapting the principles and to those nuances and making them work for us in a way that protects the members, but also helps us achieve the outcomes that we're trying to achieve as a credit union.
So maybe just one last question, Dr. Ford, if I could, to you, which is, I personally think PBR can be quite effective. It does and has been recognized that there are criticisms of it, and one has been that it may put too much authority or too much pressure for the risk assessment of the entity on its gatekeepers of the board, and that hasn't always proven effective when we look at some of the financial crises we've had to deal with. Can you comment on that? Oops.
Well, I think we've lost her audio.
We may have lost her.
Her video's there. I think we've lost her audio for the moment.
You know what? I did that thing
there she
where
goes.
I didn't unmute. I'm embarrassed to say, I'm sorry. So I guess I would say that principles-based regulation, in order to be effective, requires a few different things. And one is proper resourcing at the level of the regulator, right? Not only primarily in terms of skills, in terms of independent-mindedness, in terms of the ability to be creative and to think about what is going to work in different situations in order to achieve outcomes. But I think it also, for board members, it requires understanding the kinds of incentives that might be operating, for example, for management. So there will be places where principles-based regulation is very appealing because it aligns well with profitability or compensation incentives. And those are places where principles-based regulation will be much easier to implement. Where things can fall down is in a failure to understand the places where being principles-based actually requires, for example, changes to business processes or to thinking about how to measure success, or to ensure that understanding the risks of the business model, that process is actually embedded right in the business processes rather than being siloed off in some compliance area. And so understanding the places where management and other stakeholders align, or incentives are not aligned with the principles, is an essential piece of making it effective.
Thank you, Dr. Ford. We have time for one or two very quick questions, and then I want to just thank the panel. So if there are any questions in the audience, we'd be pleased to take them. Or online, pardon me.
Not working. Oh, can everyone hear me now? Yeah. Great. Okay, we have one question from the online audience. How do you think PBR and outcomes-based regulation impacts enforcement? And with the role played by the FST, does this put them in a place to impact policy? Does Vavilov make this even more likely?
So I think that was probably directed at me. And I can't call a friend, and I would defer to our Director of Enforcement, Alyssa Sinha. But I would say enforcement is an enforcement period. It's an escalation. I think where Alyssa and her team want to spend their time is on the harm, the greatest harm, and working with those organizations, because all entities are going to have issues from time to time, compliance issues. It's not a good use of enforcement resources to try to boil the ocean. Work collaboratively and constructively with regulated entities and licensees to achieve the outcome. If they're unwilling or unable, then of course it gets escalated. And we do take, as an organization, we take a risk-based approach to enforcement, and we look at where the harm is, and because we're dealing with multiple sectors and multiple issues, we try to prioritize accordingly. So I hope that answers the question. I do want to thank, just in the interest of time, because we're at the end, I want to thank this panel, which has just been an all-star, excellent panel for their contributions to what I think is a really important discussion. I want to thank the audience, in person and online, for being patient with us. And finally, like any panel that performs effectively, it's like the duck gliding across the pond. You don't see all the activity underneath. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Judy Pfeiffer, and her team, MJ, Sharon, and Dan, for doing all the paddling underneath and making this look so easy. So thank you very much.